Okay. So like I said, we're talking about identity today. And identity is, it's who we are. It's a mix of everything. So identities are created through communication. They're created in spurts. We have multiple identities. They're influenced by society in some way, shape, or form. They're dynamic so that they are always changing, and they are developed in different ways and different cultures. So the first thing with this is identities are created through communication. And the first thing I want to ask is, how many of you guys have ever heard of like feral children? I think that might have been something more from like the early 2000s, late 90s, but okay. So you may or may not have heard of something like this, but feral children. So children who are raised outside of regular society. You might be thinking, how does this have anything to do with identity? Well, identity, sorry, can't show you guys that. There we go. Identity is created through communication. So if you don't have any communication with other humans, then you have no way to form an identity or a sense of self. Yeah, Tarzan. Obviously, if Tarzan was actually raised by, chimpanzees or apes, please don't quote me on that because I haven't seen Tarzan in forever. He would not have a sense of self. He would not effectively be human because he wouldn't have a sense of identity, because you have to be able to communicate with people in order to do that. He might have some form of animalistic identity, but he would not have a human identity. So we come to understand who we are through interacting with other people. And then, does everyone see us as we see ourselves? The answer to that is no, because we all have different self-esteem, self-perceptions that color the way we look at ourselves as compared to someone who's looking at us from an outside perspective. So for most of you guys, you only see me through the lens of teaching. I am a professor to you. Obviously, I don't see myself as just a professor. I have other identities that, I am besides just a teacher. Outside of work, I do different things. So these identities of ourselves, they emerge or they come about when we exchange messages. So who do I want to? Okay, so Manny might not think that he's funny until he has people laughing at his jokes and saying, "Oh, Manny, you're so hilarious." Or maybe Jace thinks that he's super hilarious, but he's cracking jokes and everyone's like, Jace, that actually really isn't funny. Like, you're going downhill, man. But those affect how you see your identity as a funny person, because they're either reinforced through, "Oh, Manny, you're so funny," or challenged with, Jace, you're not as funny as you think you are. But we negotiate those with other people. We co-create them together with other people. Other people reinforce them, saying, "Oh, you're so funny, you're so pretty, you're so smart," or they're challenged by people reacting differently to how we show ourselves or how we behave than we would expect. And then our different identities are emphasized in different contexts. So depending with who we're communicating and what the conversation is about. So what is the context? If you are You know, on your way to church, your religious identity is there in the forefront. If you are on your way to school, your student or your academic identity is there on the forefront. If you're on your way to work, that's your work identity is at the forefront. If you're talking to your grandma, your identity as a grandchild is probably at the forefront. And then an interesting thing to think about is, how do these mobile communication technologies influence our relationships and our sense of identity? So does this influence us in any way by, you know, being able to talk to people all over the world, or by, you know, everyone being on Instagram or something? You know, you always have then that affirmation of, oh, you're so pretty, you know, looking great today, great job at the baseball game or basketball game, insert whatever here, you know, whatever people are telling you on Instagram. So just interesting things to think about. And then if you give up your mobile communication technologies or give up your social media, how might your identity change? How might your sense of self or self-worth be affected? Identities are created in spurts. So it's not a smooth, orderly process of, you know, every day you're, you know, happy with who you are and that you're always sure of who you are, who you want to be. Certain events tend to trigger insights as to who we are or who we want to be. Because most of the time we're not really thinking about who we are as a human, you know, what our place is. We're just kind of there. We're not always thinking about it. But if something really, really good happens to us, or something really, really traumatic, it can affect who we think we are or how we identify. You know, a positive example of that might be, you know, if you're a baseball player, you know, if you remember your first home run when you were in Little League, maybe that was the start of you thinking, no, I'm a baseball player. Like, I made a home run. Like, I am the GOAT, or I guess whatever the term was when you were younger. But between those, like, instances, we're just kind of there to an extent, like not thinking about who we are. And then of course, you know, most of the time we may know exactly who we are, but then part of the time we might be like, you know, I don't really know like what my place is, who I am, because we all have those moments of existential crisis, right? Our identities are multiple. So, you know, I'm not just a teacher. You know, Gary isn't just someone who works at the mine. Who else is here on my list? You know, Kaylee is not just a softball player. You know, someone might not just be a mom or a dad. So we all have different identities because we belong to different groups. And like we said up here, so context influences which of our identities we're highlighting. So when you're going to church, you might be highlighting your religious identity. If you're going to one of the LGBT bars or clubs in Tucson or Phoenix, you might be highlighting your sexual orientation identity. If you're in specific fraternities or sororities, you might be highlighting that gender identity. So like as a woman, I can't belong to a fraternal order of Masons or anything, because that's a brotherhood. It's a social group for men. Just like a man can't belong to the Daughters of the American Revolution, because it's for the Daughters of the American Revolution. Okay. Our identities are influenced by society. So why do we identify with particular groups and not others? Well, a lot of it depends on, you know, what's going on in the world at the time and what choices are available to us. So here in Thatcher Safford area, yes, there are definitely opportunities for social groups. We have churches, we have bowling leagues, we have a hiking club. You know, you can go out and do karaoke. You know, there's stuff to do. But compared to a city like Phoenix, the options of, identifying with different groups, there might not be as many. Because, in Phoenix, you might be able to be part of a bowling league and be a bowler, or, a master gardener, or part of the, super duper hard hiking club where you travel all the time and go to super hard hikes. But, some of those things might not be available to us here. But sometimes it just depends on, like I said, what society looks like. So if you have a minority of something in a place, you might not want to identify with that, even if others assign us that particular identity. So an example of this might be like during the election cycle. Depending on where you live and the political environment of that area, you might not want to admit that you belong to one political party or the other, just because you could have some backlash in that society. If you're like, oh, well, you're a dirty Democrat, or you're a, insert whatever here, Republican. I was trying to think of something that would go with like R, but it's just not working. But, we might not want to have that identity on us if we can keep it to ourselves. And then other people, yeah, if you're in a radical area, you might just want to be like, y'all can deal with that yourself, and I'm not going to identify myself with either of you guys, or, whatever the prevailing radical one is. And then the identities that others assign to us are socially and politically determined. Some of it could just be from stereotypes, and some of it just might be from, that's kind of what the norm is or what the average is. But we're all subject to being pigeonholed into specific identities or categories, just based on the nature of our birth. So whether we want to stick with those or not is kind of up to us. But, if I'm going to pick on Gary because I know Gary, like, if I see Gary, I'm going to automatically identify him as a man. Sorry, that's what your pigeonholed identity is. I'm going to see him, I'm going to say, okay, man in his 50s, from Arizona. Yeah, you're welcome, Gary. In his 40s, wink, wink, I don't know. But, that's what people are going to assume when they look at certain people. People are going to look at me and say, okay, well, she's a woman. Yes, I am. But that doesn't mean that everyone wants to be pigeonholed into those particular identities. And then we try to find ways to ascribe other identities to ourselves. So maybe I wear my Eastern Arizona t-shirt and say, I'm part of this institution. Like, I want this to be part of my identity. Or if you're married, you might wear a wedding ring. So Gary's married. I assume he wears a wedding ring. I assume most people who are married wear a wedding ring unless they work with heavy machinery. And then you might not. If you are LDS, you might wear a CTR ring, or you might wear your temple necklace. If you are Catholic, you might wear a cross. If you are Jewish, you might wear a Star of David. But that's helping ascribe an identity that other people can notice. But you might do things like clubs or whatever, like bowling, as a way to ascribe the bowler identity to yourself. This kind of ties in with dynamic identities. So what forces influence how our identities are expressed? So, if I live in Seattle versus Thatcher, Arizona, I'm going to express my politics differently. I'm going to express my social beliefs differently. I'm going to express my beliefs about the United States and whatever else differently, just based on the culture of that particular town. Because especially if you want to fit in places, then you kind of tend to go with the prevailing winds of whatever people believe there. And of course, identities change over time, and they change across cultures. So if we look back 200 years ago, you know, the identity of a woman is different than it is now. And even between different people, it's different. The identity of what a man should be has changed over the course of 200 years. The identity of what a child is or a teenager is has changed. I don't even know if they technically had like teenagers, you know, 200-300 years ago. It's like, oh, nope, you're a kid now. Oh, now you're an adult. So congrats, start working, you know, take care of your family. But the good thing about, you know, identities in general is that we can all have a different opinion on what it means to be a man or a woman, or to be a parent, or to be a child, or to be a traveler, or to be a bowler or a gardener or whatever. Because, you know, they are dynamic, they do change, and they are multiple. And then, of course, identities are developed in different ways in different cultures. So Americans were very individualistic. So, you know, our parents tend to, as a whole, as a generalization, try to foster a very strong sense of individuality and identity in their children, so that when they turn 18, it's like, okay, bye, we'll see you later. Because they want their children to be independent and self-reliant and be able to take care of themselves and, you know, work for their own money and stuff like that. While a lot of Asian cultures and many African countries tend to emphasize more collectivism, more interdependency, where you are working together. Maybe you stay at home longer. So your identity as a child of your parents might last longer because you're at home until you're a little bit older. Or if you live with your grandparents, your identity as a grandchild is probably more at the forefront of your mind. So your identity as a member of this particular family would take more precedence than your identity as an individual. So any questions before we move on to some more specific identities? Any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? I know I went over it pretty fast, but you guys do have that chapter 5 reading to do as well over it. So actually, I don't think that reading's too terribly long. Oh my gosh, it is not letting me type today. Okay, there we go. Got that message sent. Okay, well, if no one has any questions, then I will go ahead and move on to more specific identities. And we all have these specific identities. We all have a gender identity, we all have a sexual identity, we all have an age identity. It's just how much importance do we place on it? Because most of the time, like personally, I'm not really thinking about my racial or ethnic identity because it's not something personally I have to think about. But someone who is African American or Hispanic might think about that more, you know, just based on where they live. I don't typically think about my class identity. I'm middle class. It's not something I have to think about all the time. But someone who is, you know, in a lower socioeconomic bracket might think about that a lot more because they might be worried about, you know, having enough money to pay the rent, pay their house payment, put food on the table. So looking at these more specifically, so gender identity, so what it means to be a man or a woman is very much influenced by our cultural and societal norms. There definitely are societies and cultures where the norms are different, where there is a norm for someone to be non-binary, third gender, transgender, insert whatever here. But typically, if we're looking at like the American context, you know, we get to the hospital, you know, someone gives birth, and it's like, oh, congrats, you have a boy, you have a girl. And you get your cute little mittens that they put on the baby and a little hat. And it's like, oh, sweet, we're going to name her Kennedy or whatever. Or name him Reagan. I just realized those are both really gender neutral names. sorry, I was trying to think of something less gender neutral. But, even how we pick names is influenced by gender. You don't see a lot of men named Shannon anymore, but that used to be more common. But you see a lot of men and women both named like Riley. What's another one that I see a lot of? Taylors, see a lot of Taylors. But gender is not the same as your biological sex. So your biological sex is what organs you are born with. Alex, that's another good like gender neutral name. I know a lot of women and men who are both Alexes. But gender is how you present yourself as to what you want people to perceive you as. And then that affects how people perceive you. But our pop culture affects how we socialize with others. And by popular culture, it doesn't mean like movies and music all the time. It just means what is popular, like what most people are doing in culture at the time that you are being raised, which can contribute to, how we react and how we play, with other kids our age. What's boys play, what's girls play. Why is it okay for little girls to paint their nails but not little boys? Why can't little boys play with dolls, same as little girls or whatever. So it's been changing over the past couple decades or so, it seems. But it's one of those things that, is slow to change, and some people might like the way it is, so they might not want to change it. And then we negotiate how we communicate our gender identity to others. A majority of people communicate the gender that they were born with, but not everyone does. I was born a woman. I am totally okay with wearing dresses to work. I'm wearing a dress today, but I'm okay with wearing pants. It's been within the past 100 years that women have been allowed to wear pants. I say allowed to wear pants. Women were probably doing it anyways. But if a guy wears nail polish to class, they might just like nail polish. They might not be trying to say anything. Same with like if a woman wears pants to class, she might just want to wear pants. Sexual identity. So who you are sexually attracted to, it's very complex. So it's really hard to kind of categorize because it's so individual. You have 7 billion people on this planet. So if everyone wanted to be categorized, then you would probably have almost 7 billion different categories. But they definitely differ based on culture. The views on who we're attracted to vary in different cultures and historical context. So if you think of like the ancient Greeks, homosexuality was pretty normal. It happened. Okay, great. Then you move on to the past 1,000 years or so, not as acceptable. Varied in different histories and different cultures. But everyone is different. So try not to assume that your beliefs on sexuality is universal, because it's probably not. Like I said, there's 7 billion people in the world. So we all have different beliefs, we all have different values, we're all attracted to different people. So don't assume that your way is how everyone else looks at it. And it's not handled the same way in public all around the world. Even just, so let's say here in America, it's not particularly acceptable, or people tend to find it less acceptable for men to be like holding hands, or if they greet each other, it's not really normal for them to have a lot of like contact. So you don't often see men like hugging or giving each other a kiss on the cheek unless they're really good friends or unless they're in a relationship with each other. But in other cultures, that's normal for men who are friends and casual acquaintances to hug each other or give each other a kiss on the cheek. I think we tend to see like more women in our culture like linking arms and having more physical contact rather than men. But that's just how our culture is. It's how we have been raised over the past, 50, 60 years. We have age identity. So in the US, our age tends to be 16, 18, and 21. You have that stereotype of you're getting your sweet 16, you're going to get a car, you're going to have a big party. At 18, you can vote, and then at 21, you can drink. And at 21, you can now smoke in Arizona too. But certain ages have special significance in different cultures. So like in Hispanic culture, you have the quinceañeras at 15. In Jewish families, you have the bat mitzvah and the bar mitzvah at, I believe it's 13. So in the US, we have our sweet 16 at 16, but it varies for different cultures. So like in Europe, a lot of that might be 18, because at 18, you can pretty much do everything. But then in Japan, it might be different. But our notions of age and aging are based on cultural conventions. So like in the US, we don't have a huge amount of respect for the elderly. Compared to places like China or Japan, we have a pretty abysmal amount of respect for the elderly. Not to say it's bad or it's good, it's just saying compared to other cultures, we definitely do not respect our elderly as much. Because if you think about Japan, they have different endings to put on people's names, different honorifics based on how old that person is compared to you. If you're the most senior person within a department, then you're probably going to be the one in charge if you're the oldest. But Americans tend to value merit and accomplishment more so than age. So our beliefs about youth is different than other countries. But our notions or our beliefs about age, they change as we grow older. Because how many of you guys remember when you were like teenagers or in high school and you were sitting there thinking like, oh my gosh, 30 is so old? Well, 30 is not old, guys. But as you get closer to 30, you're thinking like, no, I'm still so young, and then the people who are getting up there to 70, 80, they might be thinking it's like, I might be older, but I'm not like old. So, but when we're 15, of course, we think like, oh my gosh, 30 is ancient, I'm going to be a hag, rather than just like, no, 30 is still like the prime of your life.
Or like when you're talking to like a child and you're like, yeah, I'm like 20 or something. And they're like, oh my goodness, do you have children or something? I don't know. And it's like, no, I'm still so much young.
Yep. Or when little kids, it's really flattering when they're like, oh, how old do you think I am? They're like, oh, like 16. And I'm like, I'm not sure if you just see a lot of like old looking 16-year-olds or if you just think I look really young, but thank you. But America is very much like a youth focused culture. But yeah, and people are like, oh, well, once you hit 25, you're past your prime. What is that thing like? There was a study that they did that like as men get older, they still preferred like 25-year-old to like 27-year-old women. But as when women got older, they preferred older and older men as they aged along with them. But yeah, America's very youth focused. We might think the prime of our life is between 23 and 33, but other cultures differ in that. But it is really fun to look at how kids see age. And then Gary said, I remember when my parents were 50 and I thought they were so old. I don't look at it the same now. Yeah, I mean, my dad's 50 and I'm thinking like that's not too old, because, aging how we perceive that probably affects how we think about mortality and, you know, people dying. So. It's like, ah, Gary, you still got 10 years before you're 50. It's all good. Our racial and ethnic identities. So some people might not think about their racial or ethnic identity very much, because if they're in the majority in a particular country, like if you're in the US, then if you are European American, you probably don't think about your racial and ethnic identity very much. But if you are Hispanic or African American or Asian or any other more minority like Native American, it's probably something that you think about more. Or if you're an American, like a European American who is living over in Indonesia or China or, you know, Ghana, you probably think about your racial and ethnic identity more, because at that point you are then a minority. But our ethnic identity is just our sense of belonging to a particular group and actually knowing something about that shared experience of said group. So, and then hyphenated Americans. So hyphenated Americans are people like Hispanic Americans, African Americans, you know, European Americans, where they identify as part of this other racial or ethnic identity, but also as an American. So I'm an American, but I'm also German American. But I don't call myself German American because, you know, my family's been in the Americas a long time. But other people might prefer to be a hyphenated American, to say, no, like I want to show that I am part of this other group too. Like, yes, I'm an American, or yes, I am insert whatever national origin, but I am also this, like French Canadians instead of just Canadians. It's like, no, we're from Quebec. We are French Canadians. Thank you. Our physical ability identity. So our ability to physically move, being disabled or non-disabled. But this changes over a lifetime, and it can change at any point. You know, you may be in an accident and lose part of your arm or part of your leg, or lose hearing or go blind. And, you know, that changes how you think about yourself and what you are able to do. But people with physical disabilities could see themselves as a cultural group. I know we've had people talk about, I don't know if it was in this class or one of my other classes, talking about deaf culture. So the people in the deaf community see themselves as their own specific cultural group. So, and it's kind of interesting actually, because this is one of those cultural groups that you could move in and out of, more so in than out. But you know, you're not always born with this identity, or you might not think about it until something happens to you. And it also, this one definitely really changes how other people see you if you are part of this group. But, you know, some people might struggle to show the positive identity, and say, it's like, you know, I'm not just disabled, or I'm not just without a leg, or I'm not just paraplegic, I'm not just deaf. Like, there's other parts to my identity. But typically, you know, a lot of us, that's the first thing we see, if especially if it's a large disability. So our religious identity, it can differ from racial or ethnic identity, but it doesn't have to. So like the biggest example of this is like being Jewish. Some people view Jewish as more of a racial ethnic identity, but it's also a religion. So it could be religious, or it could be racial ethnic, or it could be both, because they could be, you know, from a Jewish family passed down from their mother, but might be a non-practicing Jew. But there's different criteria for being members of different religions. In some religions, you have to be baptized to be part of that religion. And for some, you just show up to the church and it's like, oh, I like this place. And hey, guess what? Now you're a Baptist, or actually Baptist is not a good example. Now you're a Methodist. But unlike any conflict of identity can cause conflict, but religious identity has definitely led to a lot of conflicts. Because if you're trying to impose particular religious views on someone who does not share that or does not believe in that, then obviously they are going to not like that and probably fight back in some way, shape, or form. So
I think
what's up?
I think it's also interesting to think about like inner conflict as well that comes up with religion. Like if you were raised a certain religion and then you start to have like this spiritual crisis because maybe you don't believe it anymore or something. So like leaving a religion or like entering religion can cause a lot of like inner conflict within yourself as like certain viewpoints change.
Yeah, and that's a really, really good point, because with identities, particularly like really strongly held one, like religious belief, or racial or ethnic identity, things like that. If you come to a point where you realize that, you know, am I really who I thought I was, that can be extremely traumatic for a lot of people. You know, we've all heard the term, you know, I'm having an identity crisis. And, you know, that's not just a saying, it's like a legitimate thing that happens, because if, you know, you've believed something, whether it be a religion or believed that, you know, you were, you know, a specific ethnic identity, or, you know, you suddenly become disabled, or you realize that, you know, your sexual orientation might be different than you'd always assumed it was. That can be extremely traumatic, and really cause you to look at, you know, your entire life and say, oh my gosh, what else do I need to examine? But it's those traumatic events that, you know, shape who we are and cause these changes in our identity. But it's never fun, because then we have to find something to replace it with. We can't just have that void in our identity. So we have to, you know, find something to accommodate for that emptiness in whatever it is. And whether that be a new religion, maybe it's becoming an atheist, maybe it's saying, okay, well, you know, I may not be, you know, Jewish like I thought I was ethnically. So let me do some family research and find out actually what I am. Or, you know, I'm adopted. Holy crap, like I want to find out about, you know, where my family comes from. You know, or it's like, okay, well, maybe I'm not as straight as I thought I was. Let me look into this and see, okay, you know, maybe how do I want to identify now? So, good point. Identity changes can be very traumatic, unfortunately. So they tend to either be really positive or really negative, unfortunately. Because if you're just kind of coasting, then that's not really changing anything. So any comments before we move on to class and stuff? I guess we still have time. We might actually get this done. Probably not, actually. But class identity, so our socioeconomic class and status. So basically how much money our family makes and how much money we do, our socioeconomic status, our socioeconomic class, shapes how we react and interpret different cultures and different actions and institutions within that cultural context. So it influences how we perceive other people, perceive communication. I'm sure we have all met someone who uh, probably didn't like us very much because of what they assumed about our own socioeconomic status. Because maybe they assumed we were, lower class, quote unquote, than them, and they're like, well, we don't want to talk to you because we're not going to talk down to the plebs. Or maybe they assumed you were more wealthy than you were, and it's like, no, you're one of those rich a-holes that don't talk to people like us, so we're not going to talk to you preemptively. But if we lack understanding about socioeconomic class differences, and don't understand that there are stereotypes that are perpetuated, especially through the media and through television shows, then it can make meaningful communication difficult. Any of you guys see Crazy Rich Asians?
Yeah.
Okay. Couple people maybe. I saw a couple clips from it because people were posting it, I think, in one of the discussions. But if all rich people like that were like a-holes and mean to the people that their kids were dating and being like, oh, well, you don't deserve to be part of this family because you're not worth $500 million like the rest of us, or even worth $1 million like the rest of us, then that's a really negative stereotype. Like, not all people are like that. Like, not all rich people are buttheads. They're not all mean to people. There's probably people in this class that you get along with really well that are probably wealthier than you'd think. Same with people at the lower end of the socioeconomic status. Like, not all poor people are lazy or just wanting to get on welfare or doing this or that or trying to take advantage of people. It's like, no, like, that's a stereotype that's perpetuated like through the media. So, and there might even be some students that you go to class with who are extremely poor, who might even be homeless. But we have a lot of stereotypes about the homeless as well. But you wouldn't think that about your classmate who you sit next to, and they're like, oh, well, they're perfectly nice. It's like, well, but did you know that, they're this or whatever? And it's like, oh, well, hopefully that wouldn't change your perception of them, but stereotypes are a very powerful force. We have our national identity. So most of us in here are probably Americans. So your legal status in relation to a nation. Some of us are probably citizens of another country. Some of us might have dual citizenship. We don't have too many failing states right now. And that's what it means by a nation's status is unclear. So I guess if you're from Palestine, then that's one of the nations with more of an unclear status. So then your national identity might be a little confusing or unclear, because if you don't have legal status as a country, then how can you issue passports? How can you collect taxes, stuff like that. But we all have different ways about thinking of nationality. Some people have a very, very strong national identity. There is, however, a difference between being a patriot for your country and, loving your country and caring about it and thinking it's a great place to live, versus being a nationalist where you think your country is the best in the world and that everyone else sucks and that no matter what, your country can do no wrong. It's definitely a spectrum though, but there is a difference between, you know, being a patriot and being a nationalist. But your national identity is just in relation to you were born in this place and have legal citizenship here, or you changed your citizenship because you moved somewhere or you married someone. And then it can get kind of dicey when you have nations that might not be officially recognized or embroiled in civil war, like Palestine, Crimea potentially, because they're, you know, Russia and Ukraine right now. In the 90s with Kosovo, I believe. So just different things with that. But this is, a lot of this has to do with what's going on in the world at the time. Your regional identity. I'm a Midwesterner. People from Chicago. Sorry if you're from Chicago, but I don't consider you a Midwesterner, because Midwest denotates like small town, like feel like that, and Chicago is not a small town. But your regional identity is just, you know, that smaller subset of where you are from within a nation. So if you're from Mexico, maybe you have the regional identity as like from you are from Chihuahua or somewhere else. I feel really bad because I think that's the only Mexican state that I know. Anyways, but, you know, you have Southerners, you have Southwesterners, you have Midwesterners. Oh, Sonora. I guess that one's really close to us too. The Yucatan Peninsula, I think that's somewhere too. You know, Texas tends to have its own regional identity. Like we have that stereotype of people from Texas. People from Texas. Yeah, I feel like this is like our stereotype of like people from Texas. You know, some dude in a cowboy hat and a bolo tie. But some regional identities definitely reflect cultural identities. So they could have like distinctive cuisines, they could have distinctive ways of dressing, manners, different language. So the Midwest is very German. It tends to be like that German and then that Scandinavian belt. So particularly in Kansas, I'm going to use that as an example. A lot of German, people of German descent, but then you have towns like Lindsborg, which is basically everyone's of Swedish descent. It's Little Sweden in Kansas. You have Wilson in Kansas, which is mainly people of Czech descent. Those are the only two towns I can really think of. But, you know, in those particular towns and those regions of Kansas, they have their like distinctive cuisines. So, you know, in Wilson in that area, they do kolache. In Lindsborg, they do like molasses cookies. They have like their little Sweden festival. They do a darn good Swedish rye bread. But like in Salina, which is a little bit further north, we have a lot of Germans. We do things like bierox. A lot of the families do. You can buy them at the store. But that's would be a regional distinctive cuisine. Nebraska, they call it runza, but they're wrong. And then we have our personal identity. So who we think we are compared to who others think we are. So, you know, that's one thing. It's personal. So you have to ask yourself, who do you think you are? So if you, here, let me get a piece. Actually, I can just pull it up on, I wonder if I can draw on this screen. Boom, I can. So if I have my little circle of Kylie, you know, my personal identity. So it's multiple. So there's going to be multiple ones. You know, maybe I like D&D. Maybe I like going to the gym. Sorry guys, I have really bad handwriting. What else do I like? I like cooking. I love food. But, you know, these are some things I think about myself. But I don't know what other people think of me. Maybe they think of me as like a nerd because I like D&D. Maybe they think I'm athletic or see me as that. You know, whatever else. But, you know, this is who I think I am, and then what do others think of me? But context and external forces influence our self-perceptions. So, I guess I'm a professor too. So let me add that in there. That does not look. Anyways, you can ignore my terrible handwriting. But, you know, in different contexts, different identities will come up. If I'm at bowling league, my identity as a bowler is going to come up. But our personal identity and who we think we are and who we want to be can come into conflict with other identities. So if I think that I am, you know, of this particular religion and come to realize that maybe this is not what I believe, then, you know, that might be coming into conflict with that identity, or it might even be coming into conflict with like my family's identities with that. And then we use these things mostly unconsciously to portray ourselves in certain ways that we want others to see us. So if we identify as a goth or a punk, then we know that if we want others to see us as a goth or a punk, then we have to dress and behave in a certain way, or at least dress in a certain way, so that other people see us as, you know, a punk or a goth, or as super athletic, or as, you know, super attractive, or insert whatever here. You know, if we want people to see us as really nerdy, because that's something, it's like, no, like I'm not going to hide that, I definitely want to emphasize that, then you know that you need to look the part of a nerd. So I'm going to get me some, you know, big glasses, and I'm going to wear my Dungeons and Dragons shirt, and, you know, do whatever else it takes for me to look like a nerd. Or if you want to portray yourselves as married, then you probably need to wear a wedding ring, or some other thing that identifies you as married. Yeah, we are going to stop it there today and finish up maybe on Tuesday.